Okay, in 2 minutes. Okay, I'm told that we could start. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So good morning to all those in Washington, joining us from Washington. Good evening to all of those joining us from South Asia. A very warm welcome to this discussion that ICRIER is very delighted and honored to host on the World Bank report recently launched called Beaten or Broken, Informality and COVID-19 in South Asia. The authors are all here and they will be making the presentation, and Radhicka, the chair of the session from ICRIER, will be moderating the session. I just wanted to make a couple of opening remarks on how important this area is for not only for ICRIER and ICRIER's research, but also how important it is from the perspective of South Asia and India in particular. And I think that will come out during the presentation and hopefully a stimulating question and answer session. We're really delighted that the authors are here. Hans Timmer, Chief Economist, South Asia, Valerie-Mercer-Blackman and Siddharth Sharma, Senior Economists in the Office of the Chief Economist of South Asia. As I said, the discussion will be moderated by Radhicka Kapoor, who's a senior fellow at ICRIER, a PhD from the London School of Economics, and having spent a decade or more in ICRIER working on the labor markets, on aspects of informality, on aspects of manufacturing and job creation, and on aspects of firm size dynamics as firms evolve in India. So clearly, Radhicka is well suited to chair this discussion, and what I said was a really important topic, not only for India, but also for South Asia. Before I hand over to Radhicka, let me also say that if we just step back and go to sort of the early noughties, 2004, and maybe 8 or 9 years since then, the growth in India, especially, and parts of South Asia, were described as really fast growth, and the golden period in India, especially, growing at 8.5%, 9%. And what those rapid growth years did for India and a number of other countries was to reduce the number of people who lived below the poverty line. So the great impact of this phenomenal growth, which lasted for 7, 8 years, was to reduce the number of people in poverty. And for India, the numbers were, if memory serves me right, about 140 million people were delivered from poverty. So growth, of course, being the necessary condition, but growth also provided the necessary fiscal space for the government to engage in social sector programs. Now, if you cut to 2020 and you see what has happened to growth across the world, and especially in India and South Asia, growth has plummeted. We are expecting a negative 10% growth or thereabouts for this fiscal in India, and South Asia is also going to grow negative, and as is the rest of the world. But it's important to place this in perspective of South Asia and India, because growth has significant, or lack of growth has significant impacts on the downside also on poverty. So when growth goes up, you make an impact on poverty, but when growth falls, it also impacts poverty. And why this becomes a lot more worrisome in South Asia is twofold. One is that government's fiscal space, of course, to ability to support and do social protection is naturally limited by the fiscal space, but also informality is endemic in South Asia and India. 90% of the people or thereabouts are employed in the informal sector. And what that means is that they have lack of social security protection. And if we needed any other evidence that we need to do something about informality and the social sector in countries of South Asia, the pandemic has provided that evidence because they've been the hardest hit. And remember, technology is happening, technological growth is happening at the same time. So what is really happening is that informality in South Asia and India is something that is structural in nature, unlike in the West, where informality is perhaps by design and not by circumstance. Here, informality is really structural. And as we think about repairing, recovering, and sustaining, we have to think about how we are going to address informality. I'm not saying, and I don't think it's anybody's case, that we need to formalize everything, but we certainly need to move from where we are. We need to think about social protection because the pandemic has affected the informal sector workers, especially women, much more adversely than others. We need to think about creating new jobs. We need to think about how we are going to use technology to address the job challenge. So I think, these are very relevant and contemporary issues. And I'm so delighted that the World Bank has agreed to host this discussion in partnership with ICRIER. This topic is of great interest to ICRIER. This has been one of our theme areas, and Radhicka has been leading these theme areas, as I said, for over a decade. And I'm also extremely happy that my old friend from my college days, I don't want to make this sound like an old boys club, but my old friend from Maryland, Mani, requested and asked me whether I would be sort of interested in hosting this discussion. And I obviously jumped at the opportunity. I've known Hans, and it's a delight to meet Valerie, Camilla, and Siddharth as well on this platform. So thank you all very much for doing this. Thank you again, Mani, and to the speakers and to the panelists for agreeing to host this discussion along with ICRIER. And congratulations to the World Bank for putting out what I think is an important report. And without taking too much more of your time, let me hand this to Radhicka for the conduct of the session.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome our panelists and participants from across the globe to this webinar on informality and COVID-19 in South Asia. As Dr. Kapoor already mentioned, the COVID-19 shock has hit developing countries with a special force. This is not just because of low fiscal and public health resources, but also because of the nature of the markets in these economies. In particular, the dominance of informal employment. In India, the informal workforce accounts for a little over 90% of total employment and includes, amongst others, the self-employed, casual workers, those working in small informal enterprises, and migrant workers. These workers have no job-related protection and have limited or no access to social protection. This makes them highly vulnerable to loss of employment and incomes and places them at a risk of falling into poverty. What is particularly worrying is that informal employment is likely to increase in the near future, as many workers who have lost formal jobs during the COVID crisis will try to find or create work by resorting to self-employment in the informal economy. Evidence from past epidemics suggests that by adversely affecting the prospects for market work, pandemics have driven more activity into precarious work, in particular self-employment. In fact, even formal enterprises may well prefer hiring more informal workers as they seek more flexibility and attempt to cut labor costs to cope with COVID-induced economic uncertainty. We can thus expect to see an acceleration in the phenomena of informalization of employment relationships in the formal sector. It is clear to all of us here that informality is here to stay, and there is an urgent need to place the informal economy at the center of the policy debate. The immediate focus of the discourse, and rightly so, is on providing relief cushion to those who've been disproportionately impacted by the dual shocks of the virus and the lockdown. However, COVID-19 has also exposed the deep structural fault lines in the informal sector. So we also need to understand how we can secure a better future for informal workers and prevent future crises from extracting such a large humanitarian cost. To discuss this and other important issues around the informal economy, I am delighted to have with us Mr. Hans Timmer, the World Bank's Chief Economist for South Asia, He will be joined by Valerie-Mercer-Blackman and Siddharth Sharma, both of whom are senior economists at the World Bank's Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia, and Camilla, Holmemo, who is the practice leader for human development for India. We have 30 minutes for the presentation and 25 minutes for Q&A after that. And may I request all the participants to feed in their questions into the Q&A section, and I will take them up at the end of the presentation. Mr. Timmer, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody in India. Good morning from Washington. Big thanks to Rajat and ICRIER for hosting this session. It's really unfortunate that we can't be here in person, but that's reality. Before we start with the presentations, let me start with the obvious. We live in dire times. The human toll of the pandemic is obviously the first and the main thing to be concerned about. The loss of life, the illnesses, the stress on the healthcare system, that is the first focus that the World Bank took, working with countries, supporting their health care systems, and we will continue to do so, including a focus on vaccinating South Asia next year. But the pandemic has also, as we already heard this morning now, created in South Asia the worst economic crisis on record. It's the largest GDP contraction that we have ever seen till now. The largest contraction was 3%, and we have to go back 40 years in time for that. Now we are looking at a 7% contraction. And such a crisis has all kinds of consequences: people without work, companies out of business, banks struggling with non-performing loans, government debt rising because of a collapse of revenues, increased expenditures, materializing contingent liabilities. But the main message that we want to convey today is that even more important than that contraction in GDP is that the character of the current crisis is really unprecedented. And that means that the GDP numbers only tell part of the story. And it also means that there is a reason now really to focus on the informal sector in South Asia and in India. So a couple of examples why it's different now. Why in normal downturns, you see that the downturn is caused by a fall in demand. In this case, there was also a fall in supply caused by lockdowns, prohibition of international travel, disruption in supply chain. And that has lots of policy consequences. One thing is that the standard stimulus doesn't do the trick. When there is no supply, people can't spend the money. And that means that government support has to take the form of relief efforts, public work programs. The second example is that while in normal downturns, consumption is less affected than GDP because of consumption smoothing over time. In this case, consumption was hit harder. While GDP is contracting 7%, consumption is contracting 10%. That means more hardship for households than suggested by the GDP numbers. Final example, while normal downturns are concentrated in manufacturing, this time many services sectors were hit hard. And that's the reason why the informal sector, where some 80% of the population earns its income, is hit more than proportionally. So it is natural to focus in this crisis on the informal sector. The crisis laid bare huge inequalities. Informal workers, they don't have the option to socially distance themselves. They don't have the option of home-based work in isolation. They have less access to healthcare, less financial buffers, lack of social insurance. And that's why this most recent report that we present today, economic report, is focused on the informal sector. That's why we work with governments to rethink social insurance systems, that they include more people in the informal sector. And that's why in the Chief Economist Office, we started a broader research program on informality. A central hypothesis is that we can't wait till more people are being absorbed in the formal sector. Actually, the problem might be in the formal sector, that insider-outsider policies, they keep that sector small. And the hypothesis in the research program is that policy should focus on making the informal sector more productive, more integrated into markets by using digital technologies, and by shifting more towards a more universal insurance system. That's it for my introduction. Perhaps a final observation on the crisis. And I want to acknowledge that governments, including in India, have done a remarkable job. It is impressive, their direct response to the healthcare crisis, the relief efforts, monetary easing, attempts to increase credit. But there remains a big challenge, and that is how to integrate these short-term relief efforts into longer-term reform plans. You often hear that people say, when your house is on fire, there's no time for long-term strategies. You call firefighters, not an architect, to redesign your house. But it is important to connect the short and the long run. You can learn from the crisis about systematic problems, possible solutions, and you can create confidence by working towards a better future. And that's why it's so good that in this discussion on the current economic crisis, we do bring in the discussion on structural problems and structural reforms. That's it from my side. Again, a big thank you to ICRIER.
Thank you so much. Can we upload the presentation now?
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's see how that's going to work. I'm sorry. Let's see, I'm not having. Excuse me 1 second. I don't seem to see the screen. Try that again. Okay, let me know when you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So yeah, I am going to sort of put a few pictures to what Hans said, and I think all of the main points have actually been made. In this publication, we usually have a couple of chapters just going through basically the recent developments and the outlook, and we sort of try to really show the extent of the crisis and what that means. But I think in order to really understand how that's really linked to informality, of course, my colleague Siddharth will do that. So let me just do the full screen mode and then go down. So this is a picture of the economic activity in South Asia over the last year. And you can see 3 out of these 4 measures are services measures. As Hans mentioned, that has been the sector that, unlike other recessions, the services have really been stable, but in this case, for example, if you look at tourism in the top left-hand side, visitor arrivals have completely collapsed. And you see sort of a tiny increase as Maldives has tried to do some of these tourism bubble things, but this is not going to get any better for a while. Then you have Google mobility, movement from presence at the workplace. Again, the lockdowns were very, very effective in completely stopping the work, people going to work. And even 2 countries, Sri Lanka and Nepal, that had recent surges, they had to have you can see sort of the little downturns they have at the end. But so even though you saw recovery in the summer, since the summer, the recovery has been very, very slow. And on the bottom right, you see industrial production, and that has really bounced back quite quickly. And actually, the most recent GDP numbers already show that, as somewhat expected, manufacturing has at least been able to bounce back somewhat. So we know that South Asia does not have it's India better, but some of the other countries do not have as timely data. And this has been very important for this crisis to understand what's going on. So what we did is, what our colleagues did is they put together some of indicators of what's really going on. And what these pictures will show you, the first one shows you the COVID cases as a share of the population at the district level. In the middle, you can see the mobility decline and its change between March and August. And you can see, first of all, the picture is very similar. So the darker areas are quite the same. And the third one, you can see economic activity as sort of proxied by night lights, and also the change between March and August. And what these pictures tell us is that when we first saw these pictures at the beginning of April or something, they actually looked very much the same. So that means that, of course, during the lockdown, there was a shutdown of economic activity and mobility. On the other hand, when the lockdowns began to ease and the restrictions began to ease, we actually did not necessarily see a big change in mobility or in nighttime activity, which means that just because voluntary reductions of mobility make it unlikely that the economy will return to full potential even when restrictions are relaxed. And so this does also help explain why the recovery has recently slowed in some parts of Asia. And we have a little bit more data that I've seen. I don't have it here, but it seems to show also a slowing of the recovery. As Hans mentioned, that there have really been very strong measures. I think it's difficult to really pinpoint, except for being picky. Well, they didn't quite do this well, but the policy response has actually been quite good. There was a stabilization of economic activities through monetary easing, and you can see that for example, capital flows have been positive over the last months. The terms of trade improved, which meant that this, of course, helped to keep international reserves high, which contributes to external stability. Government bond yields remained constant and actually declined following very extensive monetary easing by central banks. And with stock prices, which plummeted in March and April, they actually have regained ground subsequently and have pretty much kept up with other sort of global stock market indices. However, there are risks that have increased amid the exhausted policy tool in some countries. And one of the things we've noticed about this crisis is that the vulnerabilities, the pre-existing vulnerabilities that countries have really begun to show up much more. So financial sector vulnerabilities, of course, are an issue in practically all countries. Rising inflation is mostly related to the supply side, but it could also constrain future monetary easing. And of course, fiscal deficits are rising across the region amid collapsing tax revenue. And this, of course, the countries already know that, but this is going to begin to be more of a constraint as the rebuilding and the recovery from the health crisis begins. And debt vulnerability, you can see this chart shows you the debt to GDP. So the larger the bubble, the larger your debt to GDP. And on the horizontal axis, the short-term debt as a percentage of external debt shows you that you have a lot of debt coming due in the short term. So the further you are along the axis, the worse. On the vertical axis, total reserves as a percentage of external debt means that if you're sort of too low on the axis, also that creates additional vulnerability. So this is sort of a sense of things countries have to worry about. Moving to the outlook, and I think this has already been well explained by Hans. Again, this shows you the characterization of this recession. On the left-hand side, you see the contribution to GDP growth of the different sort of demand components in South Asia. And whereas in the global financial crisis of 2007-2009, consumption really held up and actually continued to grow around 3-4%, or its contribution to growth was quite robust, as well as in some cases some of the government investments. And in the last 4 years, you've seen the same pattern. Here, you've had a complete collapse of consumption has actually negatively contributed to growth, and we do expect that to return, but what's sort of the people side of this is of course, income per capita has used to have a trajectory. It's going to now be 6 percentage points below the 2019 levels, even even by 2021. And so the setback in per capita income growth will lead to rising poverty. And in fact, some of our colleagues in the poverty group have already found that more than half of the post-COVID new extreme poor reside in South Asia. So in other words, if you compare the poor before COVID versus after, South Asia used to have about 20% of all the total extreme poor in the world, but the new poor, the additional poor, are about more than half come from South Asia. I'm not going to go too much into detail into this, but this is just sort of to give you a sense of the huge uncertainty that we had when we're trying to sort of understand and forecast what could be happening in the next 2 to 3 years. So one of the reasons is that, you know, we're used to sort of, as economists, thinking of, okay, well, there's a shock, and then you sort of see how demand reacts and how you get back to equilibrium. This just did not work in this particular crisis. Whatever the actual contagion rate is of in South Asia has a completely nonlinear relationship with the direct economic impact. And then beyond that, of course, you have to look at the indirect and knock-on effects. So this is just to show that we actually tried to do some projections on the COVID and tried to see that countries that may be doing things very well, but for example, Maldives, you know, the 2/3 of their economy is tourism, which needs social interaction. So there we're going to have a very large direct shock. Bhutan is another example of a country that has really done, in terms of the containment, have done an excellent job. Sri Lanka until recently as well, but countries that really have, you know, been able to bring the fatality rate and everything very low, still they happen to have neighbors that are not quite doing that well. So through the trade links, financial links, and remittances, all of these countries are going to suffer. So this is our forecasts. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but just to show you here that this is, the blue line shows you what we see for GDP growth for South Asia. And it's sort of against a no COVID case. So the black lines would have been South Asia growing around 5% had there been no COVID. And you can see that, yes, it does recover around 2023 quite well. But if you look at it in terms of deviation from the no COVID case, which is the chart on the right-hand side, even over the medium term, we're going to see that the region will have permanently lost 6.6 percentage points of pre-COVID GDP. And the sort of blue shaded area gives you a sense of, well, we don't really know what's going to happen on the external side. So there's some, it doesn't look like it makes a lot of difference, partly because South Asia is a fairly closed economy as a whole. But for countries that depend on remittances like Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, the differences can be important if you consider, for example, a slow recovery abroad. And also this, I won't go into too much detail because I know we really want to focus on informality, but this is just to show some simulations we did on, for example, and I think the most important one is the second one, which is a sudden stop of external financing. So what would happen? We know that this is a global crisis. So in addition to the slow recovery in trading partner economies, there are vulnerabilities in the global financial system. And you could have a situation in which external creditors become highly risk averse. And if there is no new financing available for South Asia, and we assume, for example, let's say that the bilateral and multilaterals just come in, but just to take care of debt service, we would see on the left-hand side, you see that green dotted line. That would give you a huge collapse, a much larger recession, and the recovery would never be even as good as in the baseline. And whereas if you didn't have these problems and the governments were able to spend on some of the things that they can do, like investment programs, social protection, that could actually really dampen it, which is the light green line. And this is an area in which we've already done some studies actually showing that the multiplier effect of a lot of the spending, government spending in South Asia is quite large. And just to move a little bit, unfortunately, we saw the third quarter numbers of GDP, and even with the very strong spending and announcements of programs of India, we still don't see sort of a pickup in public consumption that we would like to see at this point. And it already shows the fact that this is such a difficult thing to do with few revenues. So this is the picture of how we see pre-COVID and post-COVID debt to GDP changing. The blue lines are the external debt component of that. And of course, depending on the debt, you see Maldives Sri Lanka and Maldives are forecasted to be the most vulnerable on the external front. Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and India and Maldives on the domestic front. But this is something that does have us worried, because some of the research that's being done in many areas of lost decades, like the lost decade of Latin America, if the debt problems are not resolved as soon as possible. So I think one of the messages that we have on the macro side is that the region really needs to, for example, use the debt service suspension initiative, which gives them sort of a breath of some breathing space to really take stock of their debts. There's a lot of hidden debts and things, increase transparency and reach out to creditors. And this is really going to make a difference, a huge difference, as we saw in the effectiveness of the government to counter the crisis over the next couple of years or so. This is a sort of an early assessment of the long term, and I think this is related also to the informality, because we don't necessarily see sort of large manufacturing firms that are going to close down, but we do see the huge human tolls, human capital tolls. So on the left-hand side, you can see learning adjusted years of schooling of all the different countries in South Asia, and for the average is the rightmost column. And so it's about 5 to 8 years for most countries. But as a result of COVID, they are going to lose on average 0.5 learning adjusted years of schooling. And if you take that forward to what that would mean for the earning potential, this generation will lose 5% of lifetime earnings. So these are the kinds of things you don't see in the sort of macro data that we already have some idea on. Another one is that we know that a lot of people are just going to lose their skills. They're not going to be able to find their jobs from before. As a lot of businesses will shut down, many people will decide not to go back to the job market. We know women are suffering enormously as a result, and that's going to affect the potential output growth. And we believe on average, it's going to be about 1% lower over the medium term, with actually in terms of Pakistan, even turning negative, the potential output growth. Now, this assumes that there won't be a reallocation of resources across sectors, which we know is going to happen, or that there'll be new ways of doing things. We know there's going to be a favoring of digitization. So this is not sort of assuming what could be a sort of a positive outlook, which is that this gives the governments an opportunity to try to do things better and differently, and it also allows sort of new activities to come up. And the silver lining to finish off that we have is on the, this is really an opportunity for the region to integrate more into global value chains. Now, we know that South Asia is actually one of the least integrated regions of global value chains. So, but the first thing we argue is that international production sharing is here to stay. It may have changed and suffered from COVID like everything else, and services are going to be a crucial part of global value chains. And we know that the region's services value added as share of export is quite high. And what does this show you? It's not talking about what services that are actually exported, although they're there too as well. Like, for example, India's ITE, BPO, tourism. It actually shows you the services that somehow contribute to other sectors. And South Asia, it does very well, comparatively speaking, even compared to OECD and East Asia. And another indicator is the new jobs created by FDI over the last 4 years in the non-video software sector. And India completely dominates 2/3 of global jobs created from this FDI were produced in India. So again, a lot of potential here, but we do think that, and there's another issue which has been brought up a lot by some scholars even before COVID that's going to improve, is that a lot of things can be performed from home. A lot of services can be performed without having to move outside of the country or even your home. So there are some opportunities there even for the informal sector. But South Asia really needs to take advantage of such opportunities by, of course, improving logistics, lowering effective tariffs, improving the regulatory environment, and really creating sort of a digital free trade zone. So that's it on my end. I'll now really the sort of the core of where we are will be presented by my colleague Siddharth. So I'll stop sharing right here. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Siddharth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhicka. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And can you see it?
Yes, if you can just expand the slides.
Yes. As Rajat, Radhicka, and Hans were mentioning, South Asia has a really large informal sector. Workers in the informal sector do not have access to formal social assistance programs. They mostly work either in self-employment or in casual wage jobs without proper contracts. They have low levels of savings, most likely, and poor access to credit, which constrains their ability to cope with shocks. So there's a lot of concern about the vulnerability of the informal sector to the COVID-19 crisis. This is why we decided to focus on informality and COVID-19 in this version of the South Asia Economic Focus Report. And I'll be presenting this focus chapter. Just to give an outline of the presentation, I'll start by presenting our main findings about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in South Asia on informality, using both new survey data that allows us to track individuals over time, pre and post-COVID, and also using some simulations to fill in gaps where data are missing. As you know, the digital economy has been a kind of silver lining in this crisis, allowing people to work from home or allowing sellers to sell, to deliver remotely. So we ask if the digital economy can actually help the informal sector in COVID times. And I conclude with a discussion of the policy implications. Our main messages, just to give you a preview, our main message really is that the impact of the COVID-19, as feared, is biased against the informal sector. And it has also exacerbated informality. So particularly informal wage workers, people who work on casual wage jobs on daily wages, they were the most susceptible to job loss in the early phase of COVID-19. At the same time, many workers, both formal and informal, turned towards informal self-employment. So in a sense, informal self-employment acted as a kind of buffer during the crisis. And finally, it's the bottom half of the income distribution, the bulk of which is in the informal sector, that has suffered the biggest income declines. Coming to the digital economy, in the long run, it has a lot of promise for the informal sector by helping workers and firms connect better to markets and adopt new technologies. But we have to be realistic that right now, in the short run, the informal sector cannot expect huge benefits from the digital economy. In terms of policies, it's really creditable that the region has expanded relief policies and met this challenge head on. But this crisis has also exposed some long-term structural challenges. Two of them we highlight. So the first is how to expand social insurance to the informal sector, and second, how to think about sustainable growth policies for informal firms. Let me present our results on the impact of COVID-19 on workers. So here we are using the CMIE CPHS panel survey from India. So India is one of those rare countries where there was a large-scale panel going on during the crisis, and it allows us to actually track people before and after COVID hit. So what I'm going to show you is based on panel data. So we are tracking individuals, the same set of individuals who are representative of the country over time. So first consider what happens to them in a normal, meaning a pre-COVID period. So let's look at what happens between August 2019 and December 2019. So this is a pre-COVID period. And what we are showing are labor market transitions of individuals of working age. So the first bar shows people who were employed in the baseline period. So in August 2019, the second bar shows individuals who were not working, who were either unemployed or out of the labor force in August 2019. On the y-axis, we show their status as of December 2019, so after 4 months. How did they transition? So what you see is essentially in normal times, it's a kind of a picture of stability. So if you look at the first bar, most individuals who were employed in August were also employed in December. So that's the green section of this bar. Similarly, most individuals who were not working in August were also not working in December 2019. So in COVID times, the picture is starkly different. This is really unprecedented. So now we are tracking the same individuals, but between December 2019, which is pre-COVID, and April 2020, which is our first post-COVID month. Right? So recall that this was a period in which there was a national lockdown. So now look at the first bar, which is people who were employed pre-COVID. Of them, almost 40% were not working in April 2020. So there's a huge flow into not working, a surge in job loss. Right? Now, this actually differed between the formal and the informal sector, and the surge in job loss was greater in the informal sector. Consider again the pre-COVID picture. So now what we've done is we've disaggregated your labor market status into working in the formal sector, working in the informal sector, and not working. So the second bar, the one in the middle, is about people who were in the informal sector in August 2019 in the baseline. And these are individuals who are either in informal wage jobs or in informal self-employment. So once again, in the pre-COVID period between August and December in 2019, it's a picture of relative stability. Most individuals who are formal, the first bar, are still formal 4 months later. Most individuals who are in the informal sector are still in the informal sector 4 months later. And now you see the COVID period between December and April 2020. So look at the first bar, which is individuals who are in the formal sector. About 30% of them became were not working any longer, and an equal share were also now in the informal sector. If you look at the individuals in the informal sector, the share who were not working by April 2020 was actually much larger. So this job loss was higher in the informal sector. As you've already seen in this chart, there's a hint that within the informal sector, there was a difference between those who are in wage jobs and those who are in informal self-employment. So now, once again, I'm showing the pre-COVID picture, but now we have disaggregated the informal sector even further into those who are in self-employment, that's the second bar, versus those who are in casual wage jobs, who are in informal wage employment. So now, again, you see in the pre-COVID period, it's relatively stable. People who are in the formal sector stay formal. People who are in self-employment more or less remain in self-employment. Those in casual wage jobs more or less remain in casual wage jobs. Now you see that in the COVID period, it's very different. It's a lot of churning. So a lot of individuals who were in the formal sector moved into self-employment. That's shown by the green section in the first bar. Similarly, a lot of individuals who were in informal wage jobs also moved into self-employment. So self-employment was in some sense a stable group. It actually expanded during this period, and it acted as a buffer. But of course, this should not be seen positively because we know from surveys that the most of the self-employed in the informal sector earn very little. So even though some people got jobs as self-employed individuals, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were able to maintain their incomes. And in fact, some work that we've been doing since the publication of the report with new data suggests that overall there was a bigger decline in income in the informal sector. We also have data from August 2020, so which is 4 months or 5 months into the crisis. What we see here is that by August 2020, the job loss rate had actually slowed down. So things were getting better. Right? But if you look at what's happening to the composition of jobs, things don't look so great. So formal wage employees continue to move into self-employment, even as late as August 2020. And there were, now people were finding jobs, so there were outflows from unemployment, but this was mainly into the informal sector. So as a result, what's happened is that 6 months into the crisis in India, while it seems like on the surface, the job rate has recovered, the composition of jobs has changed and perhaps worsened. So if you look at the pre-COVID period, among people of working age, about 4% or so are in the formal sector, 20% are self-employed, and about 60% are in casual informal wage jobs. Post-COVID, the workforce looks different. So in particular, the formal wage sector has shrunk by almost a quarter. And the self-employed sector has become larger, and casual wage sector is more or less the same. But what you see sometimes are just the headline numbers, which suggests that overall employment has recovered. But the composition is quite different. And there's a lot of concern now about the quality of jobs. How will that recover? So why are informal workers more susceptible? So one reason, as we've already discussed, is that they are in sort of casual, more contingent wage jobs. Another reason actually in this crisis, and this crisis is different, is that it affected sectors that involve a lot of face-to-face contact intensity. And these sectors, such as wholesale and retail, or transportation, accommodation, restaurants, these actually tend to be intensive in informal employment in South Asia. So this is also one reason, this demand, this face-to-face intensity effect that makes the informal sector particularly vulnerable to this crisis. So now, another thing to note is that informal workers who are in these affected sectors, in these high face-to-face contact intensity sectors, they actually found at different levels of the earnings distribution. So they are yes, they are from poor households, but they are also from middle income households. So this chart shows you the distributional incidence of employment in the affected sectors. So we arranged households in terms of their earnings from the poorest to the richest. And at each level of earnings, we show the share of those who are, how much of the employment is in affected or vulnerable sectors. So actually it's quite striking that it's even households in the middle and upper to middle income reaches that are quite vulnerable in the sense of being employed intensively in affected sectors, and a lot of them are informal. I'll come back to this because this has implications for relief policy. So now in most other South Asian countries, we didn't have data on post-COVID outcomes. So we tried to fill in the gaps using simulation analysis. So we simulated the impact of the crisis using a general equilibrium model, and then tried to simulate its impact at different percentiles of the earnings distribution. So what these charts are showing are what we expect the distributional incidence of unemployment during this crisis. So what we find is that it's low and middle income informal workers from urban areas who are particularly vulnerable to job loss during this crisis. So for example, the chart on the left is for India for the urban workforce. Once again, we've arranged households by their earnings percentile. And you can see that among those who are expected to be newly unemployed, it's heavily concentrated in the low to middle income earnings percentile zone, and most of them are informal. The simulations also allow us to look at the impact on welfare, on the change in real consumption. And these charts show the results for India and Bangladesh, again using labor force surveys. So the first thing you notice that these charts so they're showing the percentage change in welfare simulated. So the first thing is that it's negative. So pretty much everyone is worse off. Secondly, these slopes are slightly upward sloping. This means that poorer income households were worse hit in terms of the change in welfare. And thirdly, the red and blue line disaggregate the impact for the formal and informal sector. And as you can see, the red line, which is the informal sector, is below the blue line, which is telling us that throughout the distribution, it's informal households that have been worse affected in terms of welfare changes. Now, coming to the digital economy and what it means for the impact of COVID on informality. So now, one of the things that's happened is the switch to telework, right? So we can look at data to try to understand who has access to teleworking opportunities and how that varies by earnings and by formal and informal status. So in South Asia, the data tell us that this access to teleworking opportunities is actually quite low. And it's also more or less concentrated among higher income households. So this chart is again showing you how many of the workers at each income percentile have access to teleworking opportunities because of the nature of their job. So the lines rise up, which means that it's poor, richer households that have more access to telework. And as you reach the upper reaches of the income distribution, these workers who have access to teleworking are mostly formal workers. Keep in mind that even this is an upper estimate because it assumes that everyone has access to the internet, and so there's no infrastructural issues. So in reality, access to telework is going to be even low. Over the long run, digital platforms do have the potential to transform the informal sector because they can connect firms and workers to markets. But right now, our analysis suggests that informal workers actually don't have access to the infrastructure and also the capabilities to take advantage of these opportunities. And digital platforms can remove some barriers to growth, but not all. So we looked at firms that have a Facebook business page, for example, and among firms that have a Facebook business pages, there are some from South Asia, and also there are some that are formal and some that are informal. So among these firms, they are on Facebook, they have some access to this digital platform. It seems that informal firms still remain relatively disadvantaged. So this table just shows you that when you compare an informal firm to a formal firm, the informal firm is more likely to say that the platform being on Facebook helps it in its business. But again, compared to formal firms, informal firms are less likely to engage in international trade and have poorer access to credit. So simply getting a Facebook business page doesn't really help an informal firm with other problems, such as how to reach foreign markets and how to get access to credit. This is why we think that in the short run, the digital economy has limited scope to help the informal sector. Thinking about policy, I think one message that really stands out from this analysis is that expanding the reach of social assistance programs is really important. And also, it's important to keep in mind that the vulnerable informal sector is actually pervasive across income levels. So they're not just poor. And this chart, for example, shows in Bangladesh, the incidence of how many workers are informal at different earnings percentiles. And you can see that even at the upper middle income percentile, there are plenty of informal workers. And now in South Asia, the response to COVID-19 has mainly consisted of an expansion of social assistance programs, right? Like means-tested cash transfer programs. And these programs may not reach the informal sector. So if they are means-tested, they may not reach informal workers who are vulnerable, but do not necessarily meet the means testing criteria, right? Then there are other programs that use more formal credit market channels for assistance. Again, they will miss the informal sector because it is not plugged into the formal institutions. Now, in the long run, we also need to think about how to redesign social protection systems to make them more inclusive. And this could involve leveraging new technology and big data. And we have to design a system that's flexible enough to work in the current crisis, but also future crises. So there's a tendency to introduce new programs every time there's a new crisis, but not to think long-term and to design a system that actually works in different types of crises. The second important policy imperative is to think about this structural issue of the low labor productivity in the informal sector. So this is a pretty well-known stylized fact that value added per worker is very low in the informal sector. But in fact, there is some difference even within the informal sector. So this is the distribution of value added among informal firms. informal firms have lower value added per worker than formal firms, but the smaller you get, the lower is the value added. So there's some heterogeneity in the informal sector. So despite decades of fast growth, there are still a lot of informal, medium, small, and micro firms in South Asia. Their labor productivity remains stubbornly low, but they probably face different types of constraints. They don't have the same constraint. And these constraints could consist of differences in access to capital, in skills, and in other types of markets. So now to end, I think this is just a scheme for thinking about policies. So we have to think about short-term relief policies, and in the long run about how to build better. And we have to think separately about who can benefit from these policies. So there are informal workers in households, and then there are informal firms. So for workers, in the short run, the priority should be to expand social assistance programs so that it is able to effectively cover informal workers. In the long run, we have to build better systems, more universal social protection systems, and expand social insurance, and also close digital gaps. Now, for firms, in the short run, the real priority is to help them weather the crisis by giving them liquidity support. And we have to make sure that the support also reaches informal firms that are viable. In the long run, we have to think more about how to improve access to capital, to skills and productivity, and also access to goods markets. So with that, I will stop. Thank you
very much. That's a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions. And may I request all the participants please enter the questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. And let me finally turn to Camilla for her comments.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I work in the part of the World Bank that is a very fortunate user of the analysis of the Chief Economist Office. And we work very closely with the government of India to try to use this type of analysis to inform policy and program design. So I just wanted to say a few things before the questions on what we have been working with the government of India on that I think is very relevant to what both Hans, Valerie, and Siddharth has presented. The good news, I think, is that India was quite, as many other countries, was quite successful in very quickly expanding social assistance. It expanded, extended benefits to about 800 million people very quickly. And they had some systems in place for doing that, though I would say that the quick expansion that was required also exposed some gaps in that system. The encouraging news is that, as I fully agree with what Hans said, that the crisis should also be used to look into the longer term reforms. And I think it's encouraging that India has done that. And they're doing a few things that are really important that I just wanted to highlight. One is that recognizing that the informal sector has not been adequately covered by current programs, and that a lot of those in the informal sector and those most vulnerable are in the urban areas, they have started to work on expanding cash transfers and expanding social assistance to the informal sector and to urban areas. I think that's very encouraging. The second is that they've also started some work on making sure that the delivery systems are flexible and dynamic, so that when a crisis happens, you can know who are the ones that are affected, how can you reach them, how can you pay them. And I think that's a direct result of some of the difficulties that they actually had on the immediate response. The third is that what we also saw in India and in many other countries was that benefits were not portable, and a lot of the informal sector workers are not working in their home states or their home districts. They have migrated to other states. And because benefits were not portable, they did not have access to benefits. And the new policies are starting to address this, which I also think is very, very encouraging. And then the final part that I wanted to highlight was also in the new Social Security Code. This is relevant to Siddharth's last point, there is some encouraging policy direction in extending social insurance explicitly to informal sector workers and to gig workers. And that is another huge group in India that has been uncovered. So I just wanted to highlight those sort of policies that we have been working with the government on, the very fortunate users of this excellent analysis that my colleagues have presented, and happy to answer any questions on our specific country engagement if anyone has. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I do have a couple of questions, which we can probably take 4 at a time, and then we can get to the speakers for their comments and then take the next round of questions. So one question that we've just received is, what are the social protection schemes that we may need to consider, especially for urban India? In particular, do any of the panelists have anything to say about an urban employment guarantee program? What has become very apparent from this crisis is that the urban informal poor have absolutely no safety net. So what would you propose, particularly for the urban informal sector, perhaps an urban employment guarantee program along the lines of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program? The second question is that you talk about informal enterprises, and the policy recommendation there is vis-a-vis, providing them liquidity support, grants, and credit. And the government of India in the Atmanirbhar package did in fact put out a lot of credit support for MSMEs. But the problem for the informal sector enterprises is precisely that they are not able to access this sort of credit. We know from the economic census that about 70% of firms in India actually own account enterprises, that is, those which operate without any hired labor. Clearly, those have been impacted severely in this crisis. What kind of steps would you recommend to provide some immediate relief to these enterprises? The other question is about, the code on social security. The government has put out a new code on social security that attempts to provide a universal social protection floor, or at least extend the idea of social security to the unorganized workers. Would you like to comment on that? Then we have one question and 2 comments from Professor Santosh Mehrotra. His first comment is that the 24% contraction that we witnessed in the first quarter actually undercounts the GDP contraction because the informal sector could not be counted well. The GOI did a remarkable job and gave a strong package, but actually public expenditure contracted in Q1 and Q2. So has the World Bank actually brought together some evidence of this nature into their analysis? We also have another question which says, shouldn't we also conduct an analysis using a gender lens, since women face a disproportionate impact as a consequence of such crises? Perhaps you'd like to take this set of questions first, and then we can move on to the next set as they come along. Is that agreeable to all the panelists? Great.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Let me start, but mainly by allocating the questions to the other panelists who know more of the details. So the first one on how to protect the urban informal sector, I think there you have to make a difference between the very short run, where indeed protecting jobs is an option, public work programs, that's a specific characteristic of this crisis. That there are lots of activities related to the pandemic that could be organized by the government and that can help the people in the informal sector. But that's for the very, very short run. For the longer run, I want to give it to Camilla, who is working on these ideas on how best to protect and ensure the urban informal sector. the informal enterprises, how can you protect them better? What is their problem? I want to give to Siddharth, who has worked a lot on enterprises. On the social security, again, I would like to go to Camilla. The undercount of GDP and the informal sector, Valerie might want to say something about it, but I think that's where you see an important side effect of the large size of the informal sector in India and in the whole of South Asia. It is the problem that we actually don't even know what is happening in the informal sector. We know that their contribution to GDP per person is not as large as in the formal sector. So if you cover the formal sector, you have a big part of GDP, but you don't cover a lot of the population. And what the rapid surveys that Siddharth discussed showed is that those people were hit actually harder. And that's why it's so important to have more data and better data, and not just to rely on the aggregate numbers of GDP, but to dig a lot deeper, and that's what we are trying to do. But my attempt is mainly to give the questions to the other panelists.
Sure. So we can go in the reverse order of the speakers. Camilla first.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so on the first question, what type of programs in the urban areas are needed in India? I think first of all, I would like to say that, India's sort of pre-COVID social protection system was very rural focused. I think we've mentioned that before. So urban residents, whether in the formal or informal or unemployed, had very limited coverage, and also the systems in place to actually reach them, both to identify who they are, to pay them, to monitor programs, has also been much less present than in rural areas. So I think what India needs and where they're starting to move now is on both sides. So on programs, I would say that they will need programs on both social assistance and social insurance. Social assistance, of course, can cover anyone regardless of their employment status, but it's really to provide either cash transfers or food transfers in some instances as well, depending on the needs, to cover very basic consumption needs. And what we see in many countries and areas is that the proportion of people who need that tend to go down as the economy grows, but there will always be one part of the population that will need that consumption support, that social assistance, that we also see in high income countries. On the employment guarantee scheme, I tend to agree with Hans on this, that that can be a very good way of providing social assistance in a crisis situation or rebuilding from a crisis. We have been following very closely the debates on the new proposal on the urban employment guarantee. My sense is that that's one potential of many potential instruments to have that social assistance base, right? It can either be a cash for work program, or it can be a pure cash delivery, or it can be a pure food delivery. It depends a little bit on what the needs are in the particular circumstances. Then in addition to that, I think it's really important to layer on top of that some social insurance coverage, and to make sure that that social insurance coverage is not limited to the formal sector. Because of course our traditional social insurance is generally targeted to formal sector workers. And in a country with 90% informality, it's a given that that is not going to give the protection against unemployment or old age as well. This is also includes pension programs, right? So we also know that informal sector workers do not have adequate savings or adequate protection for old age. And that's going to be really important as well as the demographic profile of a country changes. So I think that you need that balance, you need that layering of different types of programs. That maybe I'll answer the Social Security Code question at the same time, because it's quite related to my last point. We have very, very recently finished a review of the code, and we have not yet, had enough time to have enough discussions on it. So I think that what I would say is that there are lots of really positive things in the code and in the revisions, and one of them I highlighted already, which is the extension of social insurance to the informal sector, and particularly to gig workers. That's a very positive step. And there is a lot of harmonization between different policies and programs in the revised code. And I think all of that is very positive. Then the devil is going to be in the detail, as it is in all of these types of labor code revisions. And when implementing regulations come, those are going to be really key. But I would be more able to go into more detail once we've had a bit more time to look at the code. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Siddharth?
Thank you, Radhicka. So I'll speak to the question on informal enterprises and relief and access to credit long term. There's both a short-term problem, which is immediate relief, right? And on that, so it's important to kind of make the criteria for access to relief, firm relief programs more relevant to the informal sector. So, for example, you could let firms get support by showing their utility bills, right? So because when you give relief, you do need to get a sense of how much they need. So utility bills firms have, you can use that to extend relief. You can extend more relief through community-based or microcredit institutions as opposed to formal banks, which are more likely to reach informal firms. Right? So that's in the short run, you have to think creatively about how to reach firms that may not necessarily have even bank accounts or workers who are formally on their payrolls. In the long run, this is both a supply and a demand problem. So on the supply side, one thing we know is that many small micro firms and self-employed individuals, they're not very good at keeping formal accounts and sort of this constrains their ability to have a credit history, and so it makes it difficult to evaluate, I guess, loan applications from informal firms. So on the supply side, we need to build up the capacity of informal firms to have better financial accounting and sort of just improve their financial capacity. On the demand side, again, because we just
you can just repeat your last sentence, Siddharth. We lost you in the middle.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I was saying that on the demand side, also we need to build up the capacity to assess the creditworthiness of informal firms. So that's one, and perhaps working with microcredit institutions or more community-based lending could help that. Secondly, we can leverage what is called fintech or financial technology to both improve the information on the creditworthiness of informal firms, and so that's another area that has a lot of promise. It's also very important to think about how to effectively regulate fintech and the microcredit sector, so that it doesn't become a risk also in the long run. So that's it for me.
Thank you. And Valerie, finally.
Yeah, so just to add on that, I mean, this all goes into this idea of the difficulty of sort of capturing the informal sector, not just for lenders, but for GDP and for everything else. And I think one of the points that may be behind, so that yes, it's true that actually the informal sector, there is a survey, as you all know, of the informal sector that the national accountants use which usually comes in a little bit late to sort of really capture that. And just in general, it's difficult to get. And for example, the third quarter, we already got a first revision. It looked a little better than what people thought, but everyone says, well, you know, the informal sector data is coming through. So, but one of the things that you have to remember is a lot of these informal, especially the ones that, you know, Siddharth was explaining how there's this sort of informality that has become even more informal. You have sort of self-employment. And here you're talking about people who are essentially, you know, family-owned businesses. They have their little shop. They don't even maybe even have, they have a logo, but they're not even registered. And the way you're capturing them is really going to be through consumption. So you're going to see a situation in which they're sort of trying to gather together their family loans. And this again brings to another question, which is the issue of gender, where we know that there's very low labor force participation of women already in India and South Asia. And even then, a lot of them are in the informal sector, in this sort of self-employment, sort of, you don't know whether it's a household or a firm type of situation. So a lot of this can be captured in consumption. And I think that this adds to GDP in general, even if you have full formality, is never going to really capture the sort of the suffering and the extent of this crisis, the fall in GDP. Why? Because most GDP is produced by the manufacturing sector, by the export sector, and they pretty much bounced back. But you have, for example, this whole, we were looking at the employment data, even though the labor force surveys do actually capture a lot of the informal sector and the informal workers, you still have a lot of rural non-agricultural workers that are really, I mean, they're really just sort of family workers that are completely off the radars of statistics and anything. And that's where, you know, I think all the work that Siddharth showed you, that my colleagues have done, are really trying to sort of, through the back door, try to capture what's going on there. And it's very difficult. But yeah, this is a very good point. And I think women are very much in the middle of this, because that's where you sort of find the women that suffered the most in this crisis.
Thank you. We really are running out of time now, but this has been a really fascinating presentation and also very insightful, I'm sure, for most of the participants. Because if you track some of the data that we're seeing on the labor market, the high frequency data that comes out of CMIE, what you would see is that the unemployment rate, the open unemployment rate, is back to pre-COVID levels. And that might lead you to believe that actually things are back to normal and all is good in the labor market. But the fact is, and as we see from your presentation, is that there has been a significant amount of churn in the labor market. In particular, there's a very deep scarring effect, which is actually there in the labor market, where we are seeing people move into more precarious forms of employment. There's reduced earnings, there is more precarious self-employment. So, you know, this is very important to highlight, because the decline in the open unemployment rate is really masking the more serious problem of underemployment and a deterioration in the quality of employment in India, where already the quality of employment was in fact quite poor. And let me also say that I think the very interesting message that I got from this presentation, which I think is a new conversation we're now hearing, is how you see the informal sector, because the policy discourse around informality typically revolves around how do you formalize the informal sector. And, you know, this is done through various post mandates. But I think we now recognize that, you know, while trying to formalize the informal is a desirable objective, it's something that we are clearly not going to be able to achieve overnight in the near future. So we really need to expand our policy options to think about how we can actually enhance productivity of enterprises in the informal sector. You touched on digitization and technology, and of course, in your comments, there were several others that you highlighted as well. But essentially, how do you enhance productivity of informal enterprises in a way that then actually enables them to organically transition into the formal sector? And of course, how do you reduce the decent work deficit in informal jobs by expanding social protection? So I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm sure all the participants have learned a lot. And let me thank all the panelists for this absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, Camilla, and Siddharth. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you in ICRIER again very, very soon.